Hoy en día, hablo español con fluidez. But it wasn't always that way. I used to freeze up during conversations, and I couldn't understand what people were saying because they would speak so fast. After 12 years of learning, these are the biggest struggles I had with learning Spanish, starting with confidence. Now, I am naturally an extroverted person. However, it can be very intimidating to speak a language that is not your own with people that you don't really know. And oftentimes, I find that the number one problem that my own students struggle with is confidence. Now, I don't know about you, but when I first started learning Spanish and I would try to have conversations with people, my heart would go a million miles a minute, I would freeze up, and I would forget everything I had learned in 2 seconds. And then after my terrible conversation, I would think, oh my gosh, I knew that word or I knew that phrase. How did I forget that? And the way that I got over this, the way that I grew my confidence when it came to speaking Spanish was simply to speak more Spanish. I know it sounds kind of silly, but the reality is, kind of just by blunt force and trial by fire, the more and more I spoke, the more comfortable and confident I became, and ultimately I became used to being in situations where I realized, hey, maybe I'm going to make a mistake or maybe I'm going to forget a word. And that's okay. Something really important to understand when it comes to learning Spanish is that you're never going to be 100% perfect. You're never going to be 100% ready. So put yourself out there, and I promise you, the more you expose yourself to having real conversations, your confidence will grow over time. The next thing I struggled with was my pronunciation. And I'll be honest, in high school, we did take a look at the alphabet, but very briefly. I wish someone had sat down with me in my first week of learning Spanish and just told me, hey, Nate, if you focus on the vowel sounds, your pronunciation is going to sound way better, and it's also going to help you more easily understand native Spanish speakers. So if you struggle with pronunciation in Spanish, I highly recommend that you just focus on the vowel sounds. You can get these down. I promise you, you will 10x your accent in a very short time. So just like in English, our vowels in Spanish are a, e, I, o, u. A, e, I, o, u. So the only difference is the pronunciation of the vowels. And an amazing way to practice your pronunciation in Spanish is by using what are called perfect cognates, words that are the same in both English and Spanish. So for example, a word like chocolate, it is written the same in English and Spanish, and the only difference is the pronunciation. So we have chocolate, and in Spanish, based off of what I just told you, a, e, I, o, u, we would have chocolate, chocolate. So just by focusing on the vowel sounds, now my pronunciation sounds way better. Or what about a word like internet? In English, internet. In Spanish, internet. It's not internet. No, it's internet. Remember, a, e, I, o, u. Another thing I used to struggle with was rolling my R's. And in fact, I came to a point where I was actually rolling my R's too much. Now, if you struggle with this and you can't roll your R's, don't lose hope. You can learn how to do it. And even if you never learn how to do it, I have met native speakers many times who cannot roll their R's. If you want my full in-depth lesson on how to roll your R's in Spanish, click the link in the video description to join our Fluent Spanish Speaker Academy. You can also join by going to SpanishWithNate.com. One of our students, Elise, was able to learn how to roll her R's within 1 week of joining the program. Click the link in the video description or go to SpanishWithNate.com to join today. Another thing I struggled with was knowing when to use the word bien and knowing when to use the word bueno. And it's actually super easy to learn. Bien is what we call an adverb. It's just a word that describes a verb. And bueno is an adjective, so it describes a noun. So for example, if I were to say to you, hablas muy bien, I'm using the word bien instead of bueno because hablas is a verb. In this case, bien is describing the verb hablas. But now, let's say we're describing a noun. Remember, a noun is a person, place, or thing. So let's say I'm saying that the movie is very good. Movie would be a noun. So I could say, es muy buena. It is very good. And arguably, one of the things I struggled with most was understanding fast-spoken Spanish. I remember being so frustrated because I would try to have conversations with people, it would be going well, and then they would use a couple words or phrases that I didn't recognize, and I'd be like, I would get hung up on them, the conversation would keep going, and I would just be stuck. So the way I got over this was trying to master the use of context, trying to think, okay, I didn't understand that word, but based off of the context of this sentence, I think they're saying this. And honestly, another thing I did was simply saying, wait, I didn't understand what you just said. Could you repeat that? I didn't mind interrupting. Then they would tell me the word or phrase that they used. I would say, okay, right, it's this word, and I would add it to my toolbox. And I'll be honest, understanding fast-spoken Spanish is also just one of those things that will take some time. So don't feel discouraged if you can't understand fast Spanish just yet. My advice to you is get as much input as possible. So listen to lots of podcasts in Spanish or music, TV shows, movies, what have you. Try to constantly be consuming the language. It will take some time, but it does work. And inside our Fluent Spanish Speaker Academy, we actually have our 28-day Understand Spanish system, which is simply designed to help you more easily understand fast-spoken Spanish within just 28 days. Another thing I struggled with was verb conjugations, especially irregular verbs. Now, the ironic thing about irregular verbs is that we use them all the time, but they follow irregular verb conjugation patterns. Whereas a verb like hablar follows a nice simple pattern of o, has, ha, hamos, han in the present tense, a verb like ir is irregular and doesn't follow that pattern at all. It would be voy, vas, va, vamos, van. Now, while irregular verbs don't follow regular verb conjugation patterns, because we see them all the time, they're actually relatively easy to memorize. And when it comes to just regular verb conjugations, my advice to you is to study verb conjugation tables like crazy. If you can simply memorize a pattern like o, has, ha, hamos, han, you can drill that into your brain. Learning new AR verbs is going to be a breeze for you. So if you can do that for AR, ER, and IR verbs in all the various tenses that we have, your life is going to be a lot easier. So instead of trying to memorize a million verbs and all of their conjugations, first, focus on the conjugation tables. It's going to save you a lot of time and a lot of headache. Another thing I struggled with were indirect object pronouns. So words like le and les, for example. Now, my advice to you is to remember that le and les are almost always used for people. Lo, la, los, las are almost always used for objects. So if I were to say to you, ya le conté, that would mean I already told her or him, depending on the context. But if I were to say something like ya la conté, then maybe that would be referring to something like la historia. Ya la conté, I already told it. Another big one that I really struggle with and that a lot of people struggle with is the use of the preterite versus the imperfect. I especially struggled with the idea of estaba versus estuvo and era versus fue. Now, I have many videos explaining this, and I also have lots of lessons inside the academy explaining this, but the number one thing that you need to remember is that the preterite is for one-time actions in the past, whereas the imperfect is for ongoing actions in the past. For example, hablé would be I spoke. It happened once. That's the preterite. Yo hablé. Whereas if I were to say yo hablaba, now that would translate to I was speaking or I used to speak. I'm not going to go in depth in this video on the preterite versus the imperfect. Like I said, you can check out other videos here on the channel or inside the Fluent Spanish Speaker Academy. But just remember, preterite, one-time action, imperfect, ongoing action. Next, I really struggled with the subjunctive. Now, you may have heard of the subjunctive before, and it can be scary. It's important to understand that the subjunctive in Spanish is not a tense, it is a mood. In Spanish, we have three different moods. The imperative, which is essentially just commands, the indicative, which is what we use most of the time, and we have the subjunctive. The easiest way to remember what the subjunctive is and when to use it is to remember that it is used when there is doubt. So for example, if we were to say, mi doctor recomienda que yo tome las pastillas. In this case, the verb tome is being conjugated in the subjunctive mood instead of something like the indicative, which would be toma. That's because just because the doctor is recommending I take the pills doesn't mean that I'm actually going to do it. there is doubt, and therefore we use the subjunctive mood. Once again, I'm not going to go in depth on the subjunctive in this video. You can check out more videos here on this channel or inside the Fluent Spanish Video Academy, but it is important to know. And finally, I used to really struggle with por versus para. Now, por and para can both mean for. However, I find that most times para will translate to for or in order to, and por often translates to due to or because of. Now, I'll be honest, por can have many different translations into English, but it's very common, especially in music, to hear por being used as due to or because of. So for example, todo esto es para ti. All of this is for you. But if I were to say todo esto es por ti, now I'm saying all of this is because of you. It's your fault. Muchas gracias. I think you'll like this video. Click here to watch it now.